Hello, everyone. Welcome to A More Caring University, Higher Education Leadership in the Age of Low Morale and Burnout, part of a series of online discussions brought to you by the ACRL Instruction Sections Management and Leadership Committee. I'm Chris Miller, a member of the committee. I'll be co-moderating this event with my colleagues Stephanie Crow and Melissa Mallon. First, a few announcements. As Elois said, this session is being recorded, and when we have the link, we will send it out to the registrants. And just in the way of logistics, we'll begin with approximately 40 minutes of conversation by our speaker. Please ask your questions using the chat function. My colleagues and I will monitor that and be able to bring questions up to our speaker after that time is done. So without further ado, let me go ahead and introduce our speaker today. We're joined today by Dr. Kevin McClure. Dr. McClure is an associate professor of higher education at the University of North Carolina, Wilmington, as well as director of communications for the Alliance for Research on Regional Colleges. He's an expert on college organization, management, and finance, especially at broad access institutions. He's the co-editor of Regional Public Universities, Addressing Misconceptions and Analyzing Contributions and Unlocking Opportunity Through Broadly Accessible Institutions. Dr. McClure's public scholarship covers a range of topics, and throughout the pandemic, he has written viral articles on morale, burnout, disengagement, staffing, and leadership in higher education. So without further delay, I give you Dr. Kevin McClure.
Well, thank you all so much for that warm introduction, and thank you for this opportunity to share time with you all and be part of your community, especially during this late stage pandemic moment where many of us have been through a lot of webinars at this point. And I know that we're obviously in the midst of end of semester activities and busyness. And so it's humbling to see so many of you out here to participate in this conversation. I must say that my friends at the UNCW library has been a huge supporter of some of these conversations connected to morale and burnout. And so just want to extend gratitude to all of them for the multiple conversations and opportunities to continue talking about what I think is a really important topic. I'll also say that I've had the opportunity now to have multiple academic librarians as students in my graduate program, and it is perhaps not shocking to this group that they are always incredibly diligent and bright and detailed and make for outstanding graduate students. So I'm really excited to be here with you all and to participate in this conversation. So my background is in higher education, finance, management, and leadership. And if you would have asked me in February of 2020 if I would be talking to a large group of librarians about morale and burnout, I would have thought that you were crazy. So needless to say, this was not exactly on my radar in February of 2020. To the extent that I had a plan, it would be to continue doing the work that I was doing, largely focused on finances and leadership and fundraising at regional public universities. I will admit, though, even in February of 2020, my energy, my bandwidth was already pretty low. My kids at the time were 1 and 3. I was very involved across campus on probably a few too many committees. I was coordinating our graduate program, teaching our standard teaching load, trying to keep up with a bunch of different research projects. And so I was hanging on. I was there. I was doing what needed to be done, but there was not a whole lot of give in my own system. So you all know kind of where this story is headed. We entered into the pandemic in March and we went into lockdown. And that's when everything shifted for me in a really significant way. So my wife and I started splitting the workday. At that time, we didn't have a sense necessarily that this was, at least I didn't, was that this was going to be a multi-year experience. And so I just figured that we were going to push through the semester. I didn't really dial back on my commitments. I just said that I'm going to get these things done, and then maybe we'll get to summer and we'll be in a different place. So trying to squeeze in basically all of my same work responsibilities in about half the time during the week as best we could. So if I was already kind of feeling it in February of 2020, by the time we got to May, I was completely depleted. And I knew that I had reached a critical moment because I was in a faculty meeting with some colleagues, and one of my wonderful colleagues suggested that we think of some sort of creative way to recognize our graduate students because we couldn't do our usual in-person hooding ceremony. And normal Kevin would have said, that's great. I think this is a great idea. How do we put this into practice? And instead, I said instinctively, do we have to? And so it was a defining moment for me because I knew that I had reached some sort of impasse. And I had the benefit of summer months being a little bit slower to start reflecting on what I was feeling and what brought me to that moment. And I started reading more about burnout as we were starting to have some initial conversations about burnout connected to the pandemic. And as I was reading, it was kind of like reading a checklist where I just went through and said, yes, all of these things apply to me. And so as a researcher, I just kept reading and trying to pay attention and listening to others and sharing my experience with colleagues. And what I realized is that the way that I was feeling was much more widespread than I think I had anticipated. And there were a lot of people who were in a similar position. So that August, I wrote an article in my column for a publication called EdSurge, suggesting that leaders of colleges and universities prepare for the fact that there might be a lot of people showing up to fall semester feeling a little bit like I did, or even themselves in the midst of burnout. And so that is where this has kind of come from. This is how I started what has become now a multi-year project of inquiry, starting to do a lot of interviews, continue writing, continue to reading and research on these topics. And so what I'm sharing with you all is some of what I've learned so far, where that thinking has brought me, and a sense of where I hope to take this thinking into the next couple of years. So I'm going to start with something that's a little bit hokey, but I'm a professor, and so I occasionally ask my students to do hokey things. So what I'd like for you to do is to start by closing your eyes for me. This is a dangerous proposition for those of you that start to lose your energy around the afternoon mark. But with your eyes closed, I would like for you to imagine what a good day of work looked like for you during the pandemic. What made it a good day? Where were you? What kind of work were you engaged in? Or maybe who was it that you were working with? You might even think about what wasn't present or what wasn't there that made for a good work day. What does a good day of work, or what has a good day of work looked like? As I have been doing this exercise with different campus organizations and leadership groups, when I have had the opportunity to get feedback on what folks have imagined, what quickly became clear as a theme cutting across many of those experiences is that what made for a good day of work often wasn't about the work itself. Part of what made for a good day were the conditions in which people were working. The expectations were reasonable. They had space and time to think and to be intentional. It was maybe the case that they didn't have one of those days where it was meetings from 9 to 5. And if they had a few meetings sprinkled in, those meetings were purposeful. You felt connected to the people that you were working with, that you had had a chance to get to know them. Maybe you felt safe and your supervisor asked after your well-being. Policies and people that were in leadership positions demonstrated care for you. And so maybe it was those combination of conditions that made for a good day of work, even above and beyond the types of things that you were doing. What I have come to understand is that working conditions, I think for a long period of time in higher education, have not received the attention that they should. And my basic argument that I'll be making throughout this presentation is that college leaders are going to need to increasingly learn about and design working conditions and cultures in which people can thrive. And this isn't just good for us as workers, it's also good for our organizations, also good for research organizations, colleges and universities alike will perform better if we are thinking more intentionally about the conditions in which our greatest asset are working. And if we don't, that asset, the people working at our organizations are going to find somewhere else where their talents can be better recognized. So I really think organizational success moving forward in higher education and elsewhere is going to depend on building more caring workplaces. And so for me, as someone who focuses on higher education, what I'm really thinking about is how do we build more caring universities? Now, there's a whole line of thought from folks that say universities cannot love you back. Universities are not feeling entities. They can't feel anything, including caring. What I mean by a more caring university is a place in which folks that have influence are in a position to be able to do something, are actively thinking about working conditions and working cultures with an eye towards being able to attract and retain talent. And what that means is that we can't continue to squeeze people in the same way that we have, I think, for a very long time in higher education. We have to think about differently about workplace flexibility. We have to think differently about how people are valued, recognized, and compensated. We have to think about ways in which we structure our jobs and whether or not we are placing too much of an emphasis on what are called ideal worker norms. So we'll go through and start to unpack some of those types of working conditions I think we ought to be paying attention to, and also some ideas in practice for all of us to consider as we move forward. So I've kind of divided this into two parts. The first part is really focused on why I think it's the case that working conditions can't be an afterthought. And for this part, I'm really focusing on a couple of experiences that you no doubt have read about, you yourself may have experienced, but I focus on burnout, disengagement, and demoralization. And my sense that we are seeing these experiences play out in higher education at unprecedented levels. And I myself, as someone who spends a lot of time with higher education leaders, talking with leaders, studying leadership, I don't put sole blame on the shoulders of leaders for what I'm about to talk about, but I do think it's the case that folks in leadership positions have to be part of the solution. So starting with burnout, burnout has perhaps the longest research, the greatest research tradition. And so through that research, we have found that some of the main characteristics of burnout include feeling exhausted or depleted, a certain type of cynicism or loss of idealism with respect to work. This can sometimes be expressed in terms of irritability or negativity, difficulty coping. So that's really reflected in my response when a new idea got brought up and I had zero bandwidth to be able to cope with that new idea or that change that was suggested. And so my initial reaction was reactive, exactly that. It was to say, I can't handle this anymore. So that's where that difficulty coping comes into play. In terms of causes, one of the things that research makes very clear is that the causes of burnout are organizational. So they include unmanageable expectations. So when job demands outpace the resources that are provided, for example, poor communication and support, unfair treatments. So these are some of the main drivers that have been identified in research connected to burnout. Disengagement is a little different from the other two in the sense that research indicates disengagement can actually be a healthy response, a natural part of workflow. So technically, disengagement is about distancing oneself emotionally, cognitively, and sometimes even physically from work or the workplace. And as I said, it's sometimes the case that all of us go through seasons of work. We may finish one huge project and we just need to push back from that from a period of time. And so it's sometimes disengagement can be conceptualized as being a more temporary state of affairs, and one that we enter into by choice in some cases. Nevertheless, when we look at some of the causes for disengagement, especially if disengagement starts to become something that's a little bit longer term or signals a less healthy relationship with work, we see, again, this idea of work demands that are outpacing expectations, consistently stressful or negative emotional experiences at work. So if you're in a work situation where you come in every day and it feels like crisis, and one crisis leads to the next, that can force us to feel like we need to disengage in order to be able to cope. And then there are three causes that have been attributed to disengagement that I think are really interesting as we think about our workplaces. One is there has been something that compromises your sense that you are able to invest yourself fully in the work. So that kind of goes back to the piece of, is this work meaningful? Do I feel like I can connect to it personally? Safety, and that includes both physical safety and social safety. So to what extent do I feel like I am able in this space to show up as my true self? And if there are regular threats to that type of social safety, again, one of the reactions is to disengage. And then availability, again, kind of connects to this idea of your bandwidth. So do you feel like you've got the resources to be able to invest or be engaged fully in this work? And if it's constantly the case that you are not provided the resources, then again, it's natural that we're not going to be able to be as engaged in it as we or our employers may like. In response to a piece that I wrote about disengagement, particularly around faculty, somebody wrote to me that faculty may not be quitting, but they've left the building. Sometimes departure is a state of mind. And so this goes to an important point, which is that it's not always the case, as we're talking about the Great Resignation or the big quit, that some of these things are causing people to up and leave their jobs. Obviously, it's more complicated than that, particularly in higher ed. Not everybody is in a position where it's incredibly easy to just step into a new type of position. What it means, though, is that there are folks that are feeling burned out, feeling disengaged, and continuing as best they can through the work. And we can imagine lots of scenarios in which, over a longer period of time or with enough people, that can create some real problems. Demoralization has been written about more extensively in the K-12 space than in higher education, but I think there are some useful lessons that we can pull from that research even in the K-12 space. So demoralization refers to a feeling of being thwarted in enacting the values that brought you to the profession, or struggling kind of as a collective to believe in the organization's mission and goals. And so one way to think about this is there a type of values-based tension or conflict that a worker feels relative to their employer? An example of this might be within higher education. You may bring to the work a certain ethic of care, where you feel like it is part of your responsibility to care for colleagues, care for students. And if you don't see from the institution, or more specifically, leaders of an institution, acting in a way that demonstrates that they similarly hold that value of an ethic of care, then it may cause enough of a rift, enough of a conflict, that you say, my values aren't compatible with this place any longer, and I'd like to work somewhere where I feel like that's the case. I tend to think that demoralization is associated with some stronger feelings in terms of anger and resentment, and tends to be something that pushes folks to really more actively seek somewhere else, a different organization to work, or maybe even a different field. So in the interviews that I did with higher ed folks connected to morale and demoralization, Here are some of the themes that were brought up fairly consistently. One is a feeling as if experts on campus were not being consulted and being listened to, which had a demoralizing effect. So if you are an expert in public health, for example, but were not offered a seat at the table around decision-making, it felt as if your expertise wasn't valued, and things that you had been training for your whole life, in the end, didn't end up being too meaningful for your employer. A sense that institutions were making the same mistakes over and over again, so they weren't taking some of the feedback and learning and putting into practice maybe mistakes from the past as they moved forward, also had a demoralizing effect. So low compensation, feeling undervalued, understaffing or intentional understaffing. So an institution may be being aware for a long period of time that a unit or office didn't have the people that it needed in order to achieve the goals that it set or had been set for it. And over time, there were problems, of course, that can pop up with that type of just chronic understaffing, including the creation of a somewhat vicious cycle where you've got folks who say, this place has been understaffed for years that I've been working here. I'm stressed, so now I'm going to leave and go somewhere else, which has the effect of just creating an even thinner group of folks that are still trying to keep everything afloat. We'll come back around to ideal worker norms in just a moment. And then toxic positivity, or the idea that anytime folks were attempting to bring up challenges, deal with the complexity of problems, the only thing that they were met with was a feeling of somewhat artificial cheeriness, that no matter what we have to push ahead, no matter what we have to be positive and optimistic with a smile on our face, we are going to return for fall no matter what. Again, had an effect of actually hurting folks' morale, even if the intended effect was to try to get everybody to feel buoyed and encouraged, because it made people feel as if there was not a real conversation happening around challenges. So some of these experiences connect to one another. So in the literature on burnout, disengagement is kind of talked about as a sign of burnout or even a precursor to burnout. But the way that I tend to think of these in terms of distinguishing them, because I do think that we are able to kind of distinguish them in terms of causes and even more so how they show up in the workplace. Burnout is driving while drowsy, so you're still pushing forward, but you're just not as alert as you would be under normal circumstances. Disengagement is kind of taking your foot off the gas pedal as an act of self-preservation. And then demoralization is you're done. You're seeking the nearest off-ramp. You don't even want to be on this road anymore. So one thing that I think is worth mentioning is that although I think it's the case that some of these experiences can show up in certain jobs more than others, they can really be at play for anybody in an organization. And that means amongst leaders as well. And so I think it's really important that we recognize our leaders are people too, and their humanity doesn't get checked just by entering into a certain position or taking on a certain title. And the reason why I think this matters is something that will come around as we're talking through some possible solutions, but we can't expect folks in leadership positions to be creative and to take on a big challenge like this if they themselves are feeling the same thing. And it's fair to say, after 2 years of pandemic leadership, there are a lot of folks who have been in leadership roles that are really feeling this as well. So I just want to underscore a couple of the common culprits as I went through each of those. A lack of resources, and that's not just money, by the way, that can also be resources in terms of time that you have available to do the amount of work that's been asked of you. Expectations that kind of continue to mount, taking on more and more responsibilities, even maybe if there's been turnover in an office and struggle to replace that people. This idea of kind of pushing, we will eventually invest in this space, but for now we need you to do more. And then, as I've mentioned, ideal worker norms, which my colleague Margaret Sully has written about it with respect to student affairs work. But the idea behind student ideal worker norms is that we have structured many jobs and many workplaces with an ideal kind of mythical worker in mind, someone who is constantly present, always available, unfailingly loyal to the institution. They don't have any caregiver responsibilities, so they aren't responsible for the lives of loved ones outside of work. They may be somebody that doesn't have a body, by which the literature kind of means that they're folks that are expected to be able to show up day after day after day without any kind of chronic illnesses or other things that can make it that affect all of us as humans. And so the problem here when we structure jobs and workplaces around an ideal worker is it means that only certain types of people are able to shine under those circumstances. And this is part of the reason why we may see in the society that we live in, men, and in particular white men, who continue to get promoted and rewarded over and over and over again, as they are more closely able to live up to some of the ideal worker norms. And at the same time, we are penalizing or punishing a lot of people, a lot of creativity, a lot of talent, simply because we have a set of norms that doesn't really match reality. I think it's important to underscore again that these are organizational problems. So we'll come back around to that, but it's also the case that the pandemic didn't cause many of these things, right? Compensation, resources that aren't keeping up with job expectations, people being stretched too thin. All of these things existed before the pandemic. So what the pandemic has done is, I think, in some cases, intensified some of these problems or revealed them in a new way for folks that maybe didn't see them in quite the same way. And so as I've been talking to leaders, I will tell you that there are many that have said, yes, this is crazy. It's been 2 years of the pandemic. Of course, we're having these problems. If we can get to the other side of this, then we're going to be in a much better position. And it may be the case here as we move forward that we are in a very different position and that people feel differently about the workplace. But I've got to tell you that I push back against that idea. And I say, all of these things that we're talking about existed prior to the pandemic, which means that they are going to exist after the pandemic. And so if we want to really build better workplace conditions and cultures, we have to realize that this isn't just about the pandemic. This is about the workplaces that have likely long been in place that we need to rethink. So quickly, we can already probably start to connect the dots around some of the consequences here. Before I jump into kind of organizational performance stuff, I want to start by saying we should care about this ideally, or we should think about this because we care about each other. We care about the people working at our organizations, we care about our colleagues, and if we know that there are problems that are causing them to struggle or to feel like they don't belong or to feel like they can't see a future, that's a fundamental problem and appeals to our values as a community. And many of us are working at organizations that, at least ostensibly, believe themselves to be values driven and dedicated to human growth and development. And so I don't think it's unreasonable for us to say, as a result, then we should care about this because it means that we can help people that we care about. Now, getting into the organizational stuff, we can see issues with turnover, being able to attract people to jobs. There are searches that are running that are not yielding deep pools of candidates. There are searches that are failing as finalists find out what compensation looks like and what the work is going to look like and say, no, thank you. We may have difficulty convincing folks to step into service roles or to step into leadership roles. And we can see kind of ripple effects even more broadly than that. You know, our institutions often set ambitious goals around fundraising and retention, completion rates, recruitment of new classes of students. All of those things, I think, can be affected if we've got a situation where large numbers of folks are feeling as if this is a workplace that is causing me to feel burned out that is causing low morale. And so what I think is you can squeeze the folks in an organization for a period of time, but eventually it's going to catch up to you. All right, so in my last 10 minutes here, before we jump over to Q&A, I want to start talking through some ideas, some possibilities around how we go about addressing these issues. And I don't believe that there is a magical formula at play here, but as I said, I don't think these things are going to magically disappear on if we get to some other side of the pandemic. So to start, I want to talk a little bit about kind of a framework that I use in my own thinking around this, which is inspired by critical hope. And critical hope is premised on the idea that it is possible for us to be both critical, to recognize complexity, to be comfortable with conflict, and be optimistic at the same time. So sometimes there's a sense that in order to be optimistic, you can't be critical, that these two kind of play against one another. Instead, critical hope really believes that in order for us to move forward, especially at a time of huge transition and change like we're in now, this is precisely the moment where we need to be clear-eyed about the complexity of challenges in front of us, acknowledge those complexities, be willing to have difficult conversations, and be willing to have some conflict, because we're not going to get very far if all we're doing is kind of a faux positivity about everything all the time and shutting down any conversations involving conflict or change. So with our eyes open, I'm going to share just a couple of principles around solution generation, and then I'll get into a couple of ideas that could be useful for your thinking, for our conversation as a group here today, or that you might be able to take with you moving forward. So the first is there is a strong desire within all of us, but particularly in higher education, to just move on to the next thing. We in higher ed are incredibly capable of focusing on recruiting the next class, planning the next orientation, thinking, building the next schedule, and in that way, not really stopping to look backwards and think about what we have just experienced in the last couple of years. Thankfully, we have at some of our institutions archivists that are helping us to keep track of our institutional history and memory, because I think higher ed often has a short attention span and even shorter institutional memories. And so we have lost 1 million people to COVID-19, and there are millions more that are grieving and suffering. And I firmly believe, taking inspiration from this quote from Nightingale and Nightingale, that we shouldn't and really can't talk about what's next until we have had an opportunity to really pause and reflect on what our experience has been like over the last couple of years. And so what this means is that in my writing, in my thinking, I talk about some of the crap that has been the last couple of years. It doesn't mean that we have to wallow in that pain necessarily, or we have to stay rooted in problems the entire time. But it also means that we're not going to be able to come up with good solutions if we haven't first spent some time really understanding where the problems were. The second is we have to kind of throw out the window what I call easy answers. So easy answers are things like, this is due to the pandemic and nothing else, that this is happening everywhere. This is the economy. What are we supposed to do about it? Everybody's facing the same problems. Or to say, yeah, I've heard about that library over there having this issue, but I don't know that it's happening over here. And here's the thing, if it's happening everywhere, it's happening in your institution or your unit as well. There may be, differences in terms of severity or intensity, but nevertheless, I think it would be naive of us to think that somehow our institution, our library, our unit is not implicated in these conversations. And then lastly, we need to do a better job of doing our homework. We've got to be collecting data. We've got to be having conversations. forming groups, coming up with research teams to really understand exactly what our workers have experienced, but also what they want moving forward. We are making a number of workplace connected decisions in higher education, I believe, in the absence of any kind of data to help ground that decision making. So as we move forward, here are a couple of ideas for folks to consider. I'm glad to talk about these in more detail for anyone that's interested. But one of them connects to making sure that we've got folks in leadership and managerial positions that receive professional development and training. Too often, especially in the current context, we, for a number of reasons, have to ask someone to step into a new role. Maybe they step into an interim role or even into a permanent role where they aren't provided with time to really become oriented to the position. They don't receive training, they don't receive professional development. And so I think we have a real management focused problem in higher ed. And if we're able to do some real work around that, it can do wonders. We in higher ed have a tendency as bureaucracies to appeal to rules and regulations on a regular basis. And on the one hand, that makes perfect sense. On the other hand, there are a lot of policies that are old. There are policies that we have power over that we can change. Sometimes we think policy exists when it does not. I have sometimes been told that this is policy, and then I go look for it only to find that there is no such policy. Sometimes our interpretations of policy are wrong. So all of that is to say, we shouldn't use policy as a crutch. If this is something that we can change, over which we have control, and it can make a difference in terms of our hiring practices, our HR policies, then let's go ahead and pursue those changes. These things don't have to happen all at once. They don't have to happen overnight. We can make incremental changes, and it can make a big difference in the experience of employees to know that there's at least folks paying attention to this and trying something new. I think the worst possible thing that we can do is to go through the last 2 years, have all these big national conversations about working conditions in higher ed, and then to just basically revert back to business as usual. We have a tendency in higher ed, I think, to equate fairness and sameness. So we treat everybody the same, and that's how we achieve fairness. And I think the reality is that we need to become a little bit more comfortable with customizing and individualize working conditions, working plans, because we're not all the same. We're different. We have different needs, we have different strengths, and we could tap into those strengths and better support people in their needs by thinking about how we can customize working conditions, working plans, and not necessarily saying this is the same and applies across the board for everybody. Within your unit, within your organization, you can do an ideal worker norm audit, which is nothing more sophisticated than stepping back and saying, this is what it looks like to structure a job around ideal worker norms. To what extent do we see this showing up in our workplace, and how does it limit our understanding of merit and opportunity? And I think that this can be a really productive conversation about ways in which we may have recognized and rewarded somebody that's the constant over the topper, in ways in which we've limited the opportunity and creativity of someone simply because they aren't able to be as constantly available because they are caring for someone, as an example. One last one that I want to really focus on here as I'm running low on time is the notion of boundaries versus guardrails. And in this idea of guardrails, I'm drawing on work from Charlie Warzel and Helen Peterson in a book called Out of Office. And boundaries are when an employer or supervisor says, you need to set better boundaries. So you need to take control of this situation and figure it out. It's puts a lot of onus on the worker to try to address ways in which work has kind of consumed their lives. It's a little bit similar to when you've got a whole national conversation around the Great Resignation and working conditions, and institutions' sole response to that is like a wellness week, or to really promote self-care. Self-care probably isn't going to go that far if all of the causes of the things we're talking about are organizational and structural. So guardrails are things that employers and organizations do to help better protect their employees from work kind of consuming every moment of their lives. So this could include things like setting some rules around when we schedule meetings, how long meetings are, what's an email versus what's a meeting. Do we place limits on when emails get sent, for example, after hours? Do we set rules around messaging platforms so people aren't getting messaged all night long? Some places have experimented with a 4-day work week or a 4.5-day work week. Again, these are ways in which we place as an organization collectively some limits that create true boundaries so that people can have a home life and not have home and work life become one and the same. I'm going to pause there as I'm running out of time and end by saying, as I said previously, that these are organizational problems, and as organizational problems, they require organizational solutions. And I think that there are folks that are in leadership roles, that are in management positions, that can be the champions of change processes. We just have to be willing to experiment, take some risks, try something new, and not just revert back to what we have done always in the past. This doesn't have to be up to just one person. It doesn't have to just be up to the HR unit. This is something that we all can be part of. And so I wouldn't wait for this moment where a leader steps in and really gets it. If there's something that you can do or to help initiate the conversation, then I'm a full proponent of us moving forward with that. So I have my email address and my Twitter handle here if you'd like to continue this conversation through those platforms. But otherwise, I think we can open this up now for Q&A.
Thank you so much, Kevin. That was fantastic. We've been talking a lot about burnout in so many different arenas, I think in our profession and in higher ed that, I don't know, something about your talk just sort of made it clear to me and threw a lot of clarity over the topic. So thank you so much for that. I also really love the eyes closed, eyes open strategies, how you frame that. So we have a couple of questions, and I'm actually going to ask them a little bit out of order as they came to us, because I think this first question touches a lot on what you were just saying with your wrap up. So this talk, as you know, is sponsored by the Association of College and Research Libraries Instruction Section Management and Leadership Committee. So as such, a lot of the participants are in middle management, sort of middle level positions. And so the question is, if you have any additional kind of concrete recommendations for people in those types of positions who are responsible for the welfare of others, but also limited in their decision-making ability.
Yeah, that's a great question, and one that I have certainly received before. And there's this, first of all, there's a significant amount, this isn't going to help a whole lot for those of you that are in this position, but there's a significant amount of literature on just basically how incredibly important folks in middle management roles are, but also how nearly impossible the jobs can be, mainly connected to issues of role conflict and pressures from both sides, as it were. So I think if that's the case, that most folks here are in those types of positions, you can understand that. But part of the reason why they're so important is because individuals in those middle management positions are often the ones that are tasked with implementing change processes. And so if we can't get those folks on board with an idea or fully bought into an idea, it can be really difficult to move forward with it. So in terms of trying to advocate and push forward, when you are responsible for supervisees, you feel responsible for their well-being, but you also feel constrained in what you do because you answer to somebody else above you. There are a couple of things that come to mind. One is folks in middle management positions don't necessarily have to feel like they are isolated and alone. So there are other people in those positions at your institution, in your organization. I'm a big fan of trying to come together collectively, not necessarily by which I mean come together to form a union, for example, but nevertheless come together collectively to have some conversations around common challenges and common strategies that could be brought up so that it's not up to one person to try to advance this as an agenda item, but rather is a reflection of a group that says, we think that this is really important. Another idea that that I would recommend is to think about ways in which you can kind of connect with some of the shared governance bodies at your institution. Staff will often tell me this is difficult to do when I'm in a staff role compared to a faculty role. And I recommend then getting staff senates to connect with faculty senates and connecting with student government. Everything that we're talking about here has implications for the entire institution and everybody there. And so I think there can be a lot of progress when we come together as faculty, staff, and students and say in a shared voice that this really matters to us. Mental health matters to us. The well-being of faculty, staff, and students is going to be incredibly important to our future. And so therefore, these are some of the things that we would like to see moving forward. The last thing I'll say is that I think it can make a big difference to supervisees, for example, to know where you stand and that you are trying, even if your ability to actually achieve some of that change can be slow, or you feel like you hit a brick wall in some instances. Letting them know that you are trying, letting them know exactly how you are trying, communicating that. Of course, it doesn't go as far as the change itself, but I think knowing that this is forefront of your mind and that each opportunity you get, you're going to bring it up means something nevertheless.
That's great. I love that transparency there. And also what you said about connecting staff organizations on campus with faculty and students, and how can we all kind of work together to tackle this issue. Thank you. Sort of a related question, but kind of turning it around to the supervisees. So you mentioned that supervisees have maybe not a responsibility, but that they should be checking on their leaders for burnout and more low morale as well. So the question is if you can talk a little bit about how we balance kind of that burden of care across the different levels of supervision or the hierarchy of the organization when you're kind of trying to watch out for some of that additional burden on people, and maybe like the power dynamics too, if that makes sense.
Yeah, well, I'll be curious, I guess, to hear a little bit more about, some of the power dynamics. But yeah, I do think we have a tendency to, in higher ed, to fall victim to a type of savior complex where we hope that whoever the next chancellor or president, the next provost, the next dean that comes in, that they're the ones that going to shake things up and really achieve the change that we've been looking for. Or to expect the person that has been in that role for a long period of time to just be aware of these things and to suddenly take full responsibility for them and to act. And so I don't think that works. It hasn't worked up until this moment, and it's not likely going to work moving forward. That's not to say that we shouldn't be paying attention to characteristics in leaders as we are selecting them, that I think may allow them to understand some of these issues and to act on them differently. But to your point, I think a distributed approach to this is exactly the way that we ought to be thinking about it. And so this could be in the form of committees or multiple committees that have responsibilities over kind of discrete elements of this. So there could be a group that is focused on thinking critically about recognitions, rewards, and compensation. There could be a group that's dedicated to thinking critically about workplace flexibility and making accommodations for folks. There could be a group that is focused on, the idea being that we are able and ought to think about how to kind of cut this up so that it doesn't fall on a single person, because I think if it does fall on a single person, that's kind of a recipe for disaster. Now, having said that, the way that this, I think for folks in leadership positions, that this can really the way to make this more successful is to not necessarily just turn it into another job responsibility or another service expectation where we just add more onto people's plates. You've got to actually build this in intentionally into people's workloads so that it's not just another thing, it's not just an extra, but it's something that is truly part of their job responsibilities. And that may mean pulling something out. It may mean ending something. It may mean dialing back an ambition or a goal that you have set for the unit so that we are able to really dedicate time and resources to this. And I actually think that that would be a very smart investment for the future. If we, again, kind of just continue to add this on and create a new committee and a new service expectation without pulling something out so that folks can actually do this, then all we're doing is just making the problem worse.
Thank you. Yeah, I love that. We had a question that just sort of came in that's maybe a little bit on the opposite side of that, but burnout and the translation to poor performance for workers. So the idea that with, greater goals and maybe higher level or additional goals, how can leaders kind of balance some of those pressure points? I'm going to guess the question is related to with employees that maybe are not living up to the ideals of their job or, struggling with kind of job performance in general. What does that balance look like?
Yeah. So that's a great question. Because I think the very first thing to do is to step back and to ask, if I've got somebody within my unit who's experiencing burnout, or I've got multiple people where I feel like this may be in play. First of all, have I done my due diligence to think about what it is about our organization that may be contributing to that? To what extent have I relied too heavily on the organization's wellness week to try to be the only response that we have kind of fielded to try to help with that? So that really kind of comes back around to the do your homework piece. Are you having those critical conversations? Are you looking at data to try to figure out what are the organizational or structural determinants? The reality is that most people in most workplaces assume that assume that burnout is an individual problem. You are experiencing burnout because of something that you have done or failed to do. And I think that's the wrong starting point for the conversation. I think the right starting point for the conversation is, what have we done as a workplace that is responsible for having perhaps multiple people who are completely burned out? And what are we doing to address some of those organizational problems? And I think starting there with that conversation to really understand somebody's workload, what are the stressors? What are the resources that have been made available to them? Have we placed something on their plate without any training? Have we continued to add without ever taking anything away? Have we asked somebody to do 2 jobs while we're trying to fill another one? And as we have some of those conversations and figure out where the stressors are, I think it allows us to make some different decisions that can help with the underlying causes of burnout. I don't know that applying pressure is going to help. I would rather, I think, have a step back and say, we need to look at the organization. Now, if it's the case that you've done that you feel like you've got the right mix, that you're building a good organizational culture, you've got data to support that, and you're still seeing that there is a performance problem there, I don't think that, of course, there's anything wrong with having a conversation with an employee and saying, here's what I'm seeing, here's where we're at, here's kind of your performance. Is this the right place for you? Is this a good fit for you? Or do we need to be thinking about, or do you need to be thinking about your future and whether or not this field, this type of work is the right fit for you?
That's great. And I think that sort of addresses another question that came in about non-organizational causes of burnout and low morale. And that question just had to do with that, people are feeling burnout because of pandemic related work struggles. which could be attributed to lack of resources, but that's not always something that the organization can control. And so I think you hit there, but if you want to expand, that would be fantastic.
Well, no, I mean, because I think it's a really good point, because I don't want to necessarily have folks walk away and say the pandemic didn't create any problems, because of course the pandemic created a whole set of other problems. But we've also got, we've got sometimes state defunding and budget cuts. We've got, the continuation of racist violence. We've got political upheaval. We've got a whole host of stressors in people's lives. And I don't know about you, but I'm not capable of just compartmentalizing and to not have some of those stressors present in my life when I show up in the workplace. The workplace is not responsible for fixing every single problem that exists elsewhere. They're responsible, though, for helping to shape the conditions and the culture when people do show up to work. And so I think we can absolutely recognize that there are things that contribute to our exhaustion and maybe not being our full selves when we show up to work. And at the same time, to say we still expect our institutions to be really thinking creatively and critically about whether or not they have been there for all of their employees, both prior to the pandemic and during the pandemic. And if the answer is, you know what, we didn't show up for them in a way that they deserved and in a way that signals to them that we think of them as talent that we want to keep, those are the things that we need to be working on and fixing. Here's the other thing that I'll just throw out there as kind of in our last couple minutes. Higher education and other research, we are knowledge-based organizations. There are lots of other knowledge-based organizations in the public and private sector that right now are themselves in the midst of pretty significant instability in the labor market. There is a lot of opportunity out there. They are hiring folks away from higher ed. What advantages we may have once enjoyed around maybe flexibility or autonomy or benefits, we just don't have that competitive edge like we did before. And our salaries are certainly not that competitive. And so folks are going to leave. They are leaving. And so, part of me is trying to also hammer home the message that, yes, at the end of the day, we're talking about how people feel at work. Do they feel engaged? Do they feel like they belong? Are we creating conditions for that? But we are also talking about how do we build strong organizations for the next 10 years? And part of that is recognizing that if we don't make some changes, folks are going to walk away, and we would only have ourselves to blame for that.
Yeah, thank you, Kevin. We're certainly seeing that in libraries, I think across all the different sectors of libraries right now, but especially in academic libraries. So I think it's a good kind of sort of call to action / thought to end our time here today. And just on behalf of Chris and Stephanie, I want to say thank you so much for joining us, Kevin, and thank you to everyone for spending time out of your day. And we acknowledge a very busy time when we're all feeling slightly burnout, or maybe more than slightly. But we're just really glad to have you all here today in community. And please continue the conversations, on Twitter, via email, and we would love to hear your thoughts. So thank you.
Thanks so much, everyone, for the time today. And I really wish you all well wrapping up your semesters. And do be in touch if there's anything else that I can be helpful with.